Snow was falling in thick, silent sheets over the ancient port city of Patara, a place forgotten by many, but whispered about by the few who remembered its troubled past. Long before Christmas lights and jingles, before the world softened his name into Santa Claus, there lived a man whose life was tangled between holiness and dread. His name was Nicholas of Myra, a name that would one day become legend. But behind that legend lies a story far darker than the world dares to remember. Nicholas was born into privilege, but privilege offered him no comfort. His hometown was drenched in superstition, cursed wells, abandoned temples, and shadowy priests who claimed to hear the whispers of forgotten gods. His parents died when he was young, taken by a mysterious fever that left their bodies pale and strangely marked. Some spoke in hushed tones that the disease was not natural, that something ancient had followed the family for generations. Nicholas inherited a fortune beyond imagination, but he did not live like a nobleman. He roamed the streets alone at night, visiting the poorest corners of Patara, speaking to beggars, widows, and orphans. People admired his kindness, but they spoke of something else too. He never seemed afraid of the dark, not even when the shadows moved. Strange events surrounded him even as a boy. Witnesses claimed that once, during a violent storm, Nicholas stood in a chapel for hours, praying over a dying man. When he opened his eyes, the thunder stopped instantly. But the man gasped awake with a scream so chilling that even today, locals refuse to retell it. By the time Nicholas became a bishop, rumors were already growing. Stories spread of him confronting dark things, thieves who vanished after crossing him, a butcher who was said to have trafficked children and mysteriously collapsed the moment Nicholas walked past him on the street, and a group of sailors who swore they saw a glowing figure on their mast during a deadly storm. They believed it was him, appearing miles away from land. The church embraced these miracles. The villagers weren't as sure. They whispered that Nicholas wasn't just performing miracles, he might have been fighting something ancient, something hungry. As the years passed, the legend grew. Children left shoes outside for him. Families prayed that Nicholas would keep their homes safe at night. But beneath the warm stories was a deeper fear, that the world of shadows, the one he battled in silence, was growing stronger. When Nicholas died, the city mourned, but his grave did not stay quiet. Strange lights flickered around the cemetery. People heard knocking from inside his stone tomb. Priests claimed they saw footprints in the dust, as if something had walked out. And thus began the transformation. A holy man turned into a myth turned into a legend, and a legend twisted into the Santa Claus we know, a smiling figure hiding a past drenched in darkness. Because the truth is, the man who would become Santa did not only bring gifts. According to the earliest forgotten accounts, he also took something the world has tried very hard to forget. Winter in the alpine villages was not just a season, it was a test of survival. Temperatures plunged so low that breath froze mid-air, and the forests surrounding the towns grew eerily silent, as if something within them was waiting. Long before jolly Santa spread cheer, a darker figure ruled these lands, Krampus, the shadow to Nicholas's light, the beast that came not with gifts, but with punishment. While most modern stories paint Krampus as a mischievous creature with horns and chains, the original folklore was far older and far more terrifying. A world where winter had teeth. The villages were small, often cut off by snow for weeks. When a child went missing, swallowed by the forest, claimed by the cold, taken by wolves, parents whispered the same name: Krampus, the Claw. This was not a creature of imagination. To the villagers, Krampus was a force of nature, the living embodiment of winter's hunger. They believed Nicholas and Krampus were bound by an ancient pact. Nicholas protected the righteous, and Krampus punished the wicked. But the line between righteous and wicked was blurry in those harsh times. A child who stole bread might be forgiven by Nicholas. A child who lied too much, even once, might be visited by something else. The first encounter. The earliest written account comes from a monk's diary in 1098. He described a boy named Ralph who wandered into the woods after hearing bells at night. Villagers thought he heard church bells, but the monastery had no bells at that hour. Ralph followed the sound deep into the frost-covered pines. The next morning he was found at the forest's edge, alive, but changed. His hair had turned white. His voice trembled when he spoke, and all he said was, "He wears the night on his back." The monk wrote that the boy smelled of sulfur, and the marks around his ankles looked like burns. The bells of Krampus. According to the legends, Krampus does not sneak silently. That would be merciful. Instead, he announces his presence with the clanging of rusted chains and bells, a warning that punishment is coming. But these bells did not ring in rhythm. They rang unevenly, chaotically, like something dragging them through the snow with brute force. Villagers would bolt their doors at night. Mothers pressed children into their beds, whispering prayers not to Nicholas, but to keep Krampus away. But yet the strange part is this: in every tale, Krampus never appeared unless Nicholas had recently visited. The duality of good and evil. Some scholars later theorized that Nicholas and Krampus represented a balance, a holy man and a dark spirit working together. But older texts suggest something far more chilling. They were once the same being. The people believed Nicholas had a shadow, a manifestation of every sin he took upon himself from the faithful. As Nicholas grew holier, his shadow grew darker, and eventually that shadow tore itself free. That shadow became Krampus. Nicholas's fear. One forgotten manuscript from 1312 contains a line scribbled in shaky handwriting. The bishop fears what follows him. It tells of Nicholas traveling through the mountains, leaving gifts and protection, while begging villagers, "Lock your doors tonight, and do not look outside if you hear chains." Imagine the terror, a holy man, powerful and revered, warning people of a creature he could not control. The winter of the vanishing children. A particularly harsh winter struck in the 1400s. Snow piled higher than rooftops, and entire families perished. But even more disturbing were the disappearances. Dozens of children gone without a trace. Parents reported finding hoofprints in the snow, leading to their windows, never away. One mother claimed she heard a terrible scraping sound, claws dragging along the wooden frame. When she looked, she saw a figure taller than any man, its horns scraping the ceiling, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, her son was gone. In panic, villagers gathered in the church, lighting candles to St. Nicholas. They begged him to save them from the beast, but the priest, pale with fear, told them something far worse. St. Nicholas is not coming. Where light does not go, its shadow grows stronger. The unholy night. According to the oldest lore, there was one night when Nicholas confronted Krampus directly. The bells fell silent, the chains stopped rattling, and for the first time, villagers heard something else, a low growl echoing through the mountains. Witnesses claimed they saw a terrifying glow in the sky, like fire and lightning. Some said they saw Nicholas facing a massive horned silhouette at the edge of a cliff. Others swore they heard screams carried by the wind. By dawn, both figures had vanished. Days later, Nicholas reappeared, exhausted, trembling, and strangely older. He spoke little, but those close to him said he looked haunted, as if the thing he fought was not defeated, only contained. And deep in the mountains, villagers swore the chains began to rattle again. The shadow returns every year. The old belief persists. Every winter, when Nicholas returns to bring gifts, Krampus follows to claim debts. For every good child rewarded, a wicked one is taken. Just as Nicholas became Santa Claus, Krampus too evolved, hidden in costumes, parades, and mythology. But the truth survives in the darkest corners of alpine folklore. There is no Santa without Krampus. There is no light without the shadow. And Krampus always comes back. Winter had tightened its grip on Europe. The nights had become unnaturally long, so long that villagers began marking candles to see if the darkness was stretching. Snow blanketed everything in a dead quiet, smothering the world under a thick, cold silence that felt almost watchful. This was the winter when the world learned that St. Nicholas did not only bring joy, he also came to collect a debt. The children who vanished without a sound. In the small town of Lutzelburg, strange footprints appeared at the start of December, tiny, bare footprints in the snow, even though no child was outside at night. At first, villagers thought nothing of it, until they noticed something worse. The footprints never returned. Every trail ended at the tree line of the forest, as if the children walked inside willingly or were lured. The first missing child was a boy named Emil. His mother said she tucked him into bed at sundown. When she checked again at midnight, his blanket was untouched, perfectly smooth. There were no signs of a struggle, no open windows, no footprints inside. Only his shoes were gone, placed neatly by the door, waiting. It was the same pattern with every missing child. No broken locks, no forced entry, no screams, no signs of struggle. And always the shoes left behind, as though the children left willingly, following something they trusted. They follow the man in red. 2 days later, little Marie returned, but something was wrong. She walked slowly into town barefoot, her skin pale blue, her hair dusted with frost. Villagers rushed toward her, crying with relief, yet Marie did not smile, did not speak. She just repeated one sentence in a hollow whisper. "We followed the man in red." When her mother clutched her in her arms, the woman screamed in horror. Marie's back was covered in long, thin scratches, almost like branches or claws. And when questioned, she described something chilling. A tall man who glowed faintly in the dark, a gentle voice calling their names, bells ringing softly, almost lovingly, warmth that made them trust him. And then nothing but cold. Nicholas, or something wearing his appearance. The markings on the trees. Local hunters searched the forest where the footprints led. Deep inside, they discovered trees, hundreds of them, etched with strange symbols, spirals, hooks, intersecting lines that looked disturbingly like chains. One hunter touched the carvings. Within minutes, he collapsed. His eyes rolled back, and from his mouth came a soft, childlike whisper. "He needs them for the night of binding." He died hours later. His body froze solid from the inside. The night of binding. An old hermit claimed to know the meaning of the markings. According to him, Nicholas, before becoming a saint, once confronted a powerful winter spirit. He defeated it, but could not destroy it. So he bound the creature beneath the deepest roots of the forest with a ritual that required an unthinkable price: the innocence of children. Not their lives, their innocence. Once every century, the hermit muttered, the ritual must be renewed, or the beast is set free. This meant the children weren't taken to be killed. They were taken to be drained, stripped of purity, to strengthen the weakening chains. And every century Nicholas returned to perform the ritual again. Not as Santa, not as a saint, but as a guardian of an ancient prison. The ritual site. 2 weeks after the first vanishing, the villagers finally found it. Deep within the forest lay a clearing that did not appear on any map, circular, too perfect, as though carved by something not human. The ground was bare, no snow dared to fall here. In the center stood a tree unlike any other, twisted, blackened, its bark scarred with claw marks, as if something inside was trying to break free. At the base of the tree were tiny handprints, small scratches, bits of torn fabric, and dozens of children's shoes arranged in a perfect circle. It looked like an altar, a place where innocence was exchanged for survival. A man with a hooded cloak. One night, as the villagers stood at the edge of the clearing, they saw a figure approach the twisted tree. A tall man, a hooded cloak, a faint red glow beneath it, like embers pulsing through fabric. The villagers watched from the shadows, unable to move. The man lifted a staff carved with golden symbols. He whispered a prayer, and the tree began to shake violently. Something inside roared. The villagers fled in terror, but one man stayed long enough to hear the hooded figure whisper, "Forgive me, children, but without your purity, the world burns." The truth was clear. It was Nicholas, but not the Nicholas from songs or stories. This Nicholas was a guardian of an ancient prison, keeping a monstrous force chained beneath the earth, and every century he paid the price in innocence, a price taken from children. The return of the missing. At dawn, most of the missing children stumbled out of the forest, barely conscious. They were alive, but never the same. Some became mute, some never slept again. Some cried when they heard bells, others would not enter churches. One boy woke screaming every December for the rest of his life, shouting, "Don't let the red man take me again." The world eventually forgot this story. It was buried, rewritten, sanitized. Santa Claus became a symbol of joy. The truth became a nightmare locked behind folklore. But the villagers of Lutzelburg kept one tradition. Every winter they leave out shoes by the door, not for gifts, but as an offering. A reminder to Nicholas, a plea. Take the shoes, but leave the children. Winter is normally a season of stillness, but the winter of 1462 was remembered as something far worse, a season of screams. A season when St. Nicholas's shadow returned to reclaim a debt that had been left unpaid for far too long. The villagers called it the winter slaughter, a name whispered even generations later, as though speaking it aloud might awaken what still sleeps beneath the ice. The year the snow turned red. The first sign came early. Snow began falling before autumn had even ended, thick, heavy flakes that coated the fields like frostbite. Animals refused to leave their barns. Wolves howled constantly at night, pacing the tree line as if keeping watch. And then came the deaths. It began with livestock, found ripped open, dragged several feet across the snow as though something massive had grabbed them. Their bodies were drained, the blood drawn into perfect circular patterns. The villagers didn't need an expert. They had seen these patterns before. They were the same symbols carved into the ritual trees from chapter 3. And the elders trembled, saying, "He has awakened again." The bells that should not ring. On the third night, townsfolk were awakened by the sound of bells, soft at first, then growing louder. But these were not church bells. They were uneven, discordant, dragged across the ground. The bells of Krampus. Families locked their doors, candles flickered, women clutched their children, forcing them to hide under beds, in cupboards, behind heavy furniture. One man peeked through his window. He saw a towering silhouette moving between the houses, its antlers scraping the roofs, its limbs impossibly long. Chains hung from its arms, dragging through the snow with a shrill metallic cry. The man's wife begged him not to look, but he did. The next morning, they found him frozen in place, standing at the window, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, his entire body solid ice. His wife said he whispered 4 words before he died. "He isn't alone tonight." A man in red, but not Nicholas. The worst came on the 7th night. Villagers saw him. At first, they thought it was Nicholas, the red robes, the staff, the silhouette unmistakable. But as he approached, they noticed. His robe was soaked in dark, wet streaks. His staff was twisted, charred, almost burnt. His shadow moved independently. His face was hidden beneath a hood too deep to see into. And the air around him was freezing, cold so intense it caused frostbite just standing near. A young girl, brave and foolish, stepped forward. "St. Nicholas, have you come to protect us?" The hooded figure tilted its head. The girl screamed, not in fear, but in agony. Her skin blistered, her hair turned white, and she collapsed to the ground in seconds. The figure never touched her. It simply looked at her. The villagers realized the horrible truth. This was not Saint Nicholas. It was the shadow of Nicholas, the part of him too dark and too ancient to be contained. Some called it the Red Wraith. Others called it the Unbound Patron. But the priests had another name for it, the Price Collector. The slaughter began. Doors flew off their hinges, windows burst, chains whipped through the streets like living serpents. Krampus took the wicked, the Red Wraith took the innocent. This was not punishment, this was harvesting. One witness, a monk who survived only because he hid under a corpse, recalled, "They moved together like two parts of one being, one long shadow cast by two figures." Parents threw their children down wells to hide them. Some set their homes on fire just to keep the creatures out. Others tried fleeing into the woods, but were found torn apart, tracks leading in circles, as if a greater force confused their steps. And through it all, the villagers heard one sound over and over, soft bells ringing, a lullaby twisted into a death song. The return of Saint Nicholas. At the height of the slaughter, when the village burned, when the screams filled the sky, another figure appeared, Saint Nicholas, the real one. But not the warm, gentle figure of paintings. No, this Nicholas looked exhausted beyond belief, older, weary, trembling, his beard grayed with frost, his eyes sunken with guilt. He walked into the burning village, carrying a lantern that glowed faintly gold. As he raised it, both Krampus and the Red Wraith recoiled, but they did not flee. They bowed. The villagers realized something horrifying. These creatures weren't enemies of Nicholas. They were bound to him. They were the darkness he carried, the burden he could never abandon. Nicholas lowered his head and whispered something the survivors never forgot. "Forgive me, but the chains must be fed." With that, the Red Wraith dissolved into black smoke. Krampus vanished into the trees. The bells stopped. The slaughter ended as suddenly as it began. The silence after. When morning came, the snow had turned pink. More than half the village was gone. Children, adults, animals. Only a few remained, traumatized and broken. Nicholas buried the dead himself, every single one. He wept, openly, painfully, but he never explained what happened. Only one survivor dared to confront him. "You're a saint. Why didn't you stop them?" Nicholas looked at her with hollow eyes. "Because I am not their master. I am their prisoner." That winter became a forbidden story, covered up by the church, erased from records, buried under the cheerful myth of Santa Claus. But the truth lingered in one final detail. The last villager to see Nicholas alive watched him walk into the mountains alone, whispering to the wind, "Next century, it begins again."
Long before the North Pole, before reindeer, before stockings hung by the fire, the Dutch had a version of Santa unlike anything in modern memory. He was called Sinterklaas, a figure not born from kindness, but from fear, ritual, and authority. Unlike the jolly Santa, Sinterklaas was stern, judgmental, and unyielding. He walked among the villages not to delight children, but to ensure they obeyed, or else. A holy man of night.
Sinterklaas appeared each December, riding a ghostly white horse across rooftops. The villagers could hear the echoing of his hooves before he even arrived, a sound that carried like wind across the cobblestone streets. He was clothed as a bishop, complete with mitre and robes, but something about him was unnatural. His presence caused frost to form instantly on windows. The air grew still, almost suffocating. Candles flickered nervously, as if aware of an unseen tension. He didn't knock at doors. He didn't ring bells. He simply appeared, sometimes in doorways, sometimes at windows, his gaze scanning the room with piercing intensity. Children who misbehaved were never safe. Sinterklaas carried not only gifts of gold for the obedient, but switches, sacks, and warnings for the disobedient. And when he judged, the consequences were immediate. The legends of punishment. Stories recorded by villagers tell of a boy caught stealing bread, who awoke tied to a chair with a stick across his knees. He spent the night shaking in terror until the morning bell. A girl who told lies found her shoes filled not with candy, but with coal and small thorned branches. The thorns were said to sting as if infused with holy fire. Families who tried to hide their children would find them mysteriously returned to their beds, perfectly clean, yet carrying faint scratches and frost burns. Sinterklaas was not a figure of malice, at least not entirely. He was a judge, an enforcer, a guardian of morality. But in the darkness of the night, when children could not sleep, his presence was terrifying. Some villagers claimed that his judgment extended beyond the living. They said Sinterklaas could peer into the souls of the dead, judging their deeds and warning the living to behave. The line between saint and specter blurred. The sack of children. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Sinterklaas is the sack he carried. It was not merely for gifts. In the oldest tales, the sack was large enough to hold a child or more. Villagers recounted nights when children were heard crying inside the sack, only for Sinterklaas to return them by morning, unharmed but shaken. Some priests warned that the sack symbolized a darker ritual tied to St. Nicholas's power and the spirits of the winter woods. The children were never taken permanently. They were tested, a rite of passage to see if their innocence, courage, and virtue remained intact. The dark horse. Sinterklaas's horse was not ordinary. It was said to fly across rooftops, leaping impossibly from house to house. But legends hint that the horse was possessed by spirits of the dead, souls that Nicholas had once judged in Myra, now bound to serve him in perpetuity. Villagers swore they could hear whispers in the wind, children's voices mixed with the hollow sound of hooves echoing across the night. Those who ventured out to see the horse often never returned, or returned changed, silent, pale, and fearful of the dark. The power of fear. What separated Sinterklaas from the modern Santa was not merely his appearance, it was the fear he instilled. Gift-giving was secondary, judgment was primary, obedience was survival. Parents used him as a living tool of discipline. "Behave, or Sinterklaas will come for you," they whispered. But the oldest manuscripts, hidden in monastery archives, suggest something even darker. Sinterklaas could see what children could not see. He saw the choices they had yet to make. He measured the potential of their souls and marked them accordingly. and those who failed his unseen test were remembered forever. The merging of myths. By the 16th century, Dutch immigrants carried the story of Sinterklaas to other lands. His presence began to merge with other local folklore, Krampus, Knecht Ruprecht, the Yule goat, forming a network of winter spirits of judgment. Yet the core remained, a holy figure, terrifying in the night, appearing silently, capable of both reward and punishment. The original Sinterklaas was not a man of merriment. He was a figure of awe, dread, and respect, an enforcer of moral law who wandered the dark streets, balancing miracles and fear with every step. And while the modern Santa Claus would later erase the terror, the shadows of Sinterklaas's night still linger. They whisper in folklore, in dreams, and in the cold wind of winter nights.
In some of the earliest European towns, Christmas was not a festival of joy, but a night bathed in fear and ritual. Candles flickered in the cold wind, church bells tolled unevenly, and shadows seemed longer than the rooftops themselves. This was the era when Saint Nicholas, or the figure who would become Santa Claus, was associated with something terrifying and corporeal, the blood-lit Christmas. The origin of blood rituals. Historical manuscripts describe strange ceremonies held in December, long before Santa became a giver of gifts. Children's shoes were left by the hearth, not only for coins, but for small offerings of blood or symbolic acts. Livestock were sometimes sacrificed in secret, a practice meant to appease winter spirits. Villagers whispered that these rituals were necessary to bind the shadows of Nicholas's dark side, the same force that had once brought terror in the alpine forests. The blood was never wasted. It was poured on the soil, smeared on tree trunks, or traced in circles around doors and windows. It was said to act as a warning, "Do not misbehave, or the Punisher will come." The children who were tested. The most horrifying accounts tell of children who were brought to the edge of death in these rituals, not to harm them permanently, but to test their innocence, courage, and purity. One tale recounts a boy named Tomas who vanished in the forest for 3 nights. He returned pale, trembling, and haunted, but alive. He claimed that a man in red, taller than any human, touched him with glowing hands, whispering words that burned into his mind. His shoes were filled with coal, yet he no longer feared death. The villagers began to see a pattern. Nicholas's punishments were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They were preparations. For what, they could not know. But the terrifying figure of the Red Man was slowly shaping the line between reward and fear. The winter night terror. On the coldest nights, witnesses claimed Nicholas would walk silently across the frozen towns. The snow did not crunch under his feet. His breath did not fog the air, but he carried an aura of frost, so cold it caused icicles to form on windowsills. Children who were too naughty, too curious, or too defiant would vanish. Their parents would wake to find footprints leading into forests that did not exist on any map, and shoes left carefully by the hearth. Villagers whispered about glowing eyes in the tree line, shadows moving independently, and chains rattling in impossible directions. And in the center of every terrifying tale, one line repeated itself.
He comes to take what belongs to the winter and to those who are unworthy. The transformation into modern Santa Claus. Over centuries, these terrifying rituals began to soften, but traces remain in tradition. Shoes by the fireplace, small gifts or treats, coal for the naughty. The modern, jolly Santa Claus was a sanitized version of something far older and far darker. A being who carried both miracle and judgment, reward and punishment in his hands. The blood rituals, the punishments, the fear were erased from memory, but the bones of the old practices remained hidden beneath festive cheer. Even today, folklore from remote villages hints that these traditions are more than myth, that in the shadows of winter nights, something red and tall still walks, keeping the balance between joy and terror.
Even after centuries, the darkness of winter lingered. Long before cheerful Christmas trees and twinkling lights, the Yuletide season was a time of shadows, fear, and unspoken rituals. Villagers would gather in their homes as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, only to feel the chill of unseen eyes watching from the forests, hills, and rooftops. They called them the Yuletide shadows, figures born of the same dark legacy that had once accompanied Saint Nicholas. The origin of the shadows. Legends claim that every time Nicholas or his darker counterpart walked the earth, he left traces of his power behind. These traces became spirits, neither fully benevolent nor malevolent. Some appeared as black, wispy figures stretching across the walls of homes. Others mimicked children's laughter, luring the curious into the snow. And a few bore glowing red eyes, watching silently, ready to punish disobedience. These shadows were particularly active during long, cold winter nights when humans were weakest and fear ran strongest. The warnings of the elders. Elders taught their children, "When the wind whispers through the chimney, do not leave your bed. When the bells sound uneven, do not answer. When a red figure passes by, remember, not all gifts are kind." Stories describe houses where furniture shifted overnight, candles extinguished by invisible hands, and faint footsteps pacing along hallways. Those who ignored the warnings sometimes vanished, their parents finding only tiny, perfectly arranged shoes by the hearth the next morning. Some children returned months later, changed. Their eyes were darkened, voices hollow, and they spoke of whispers in the snow, calling them to unknown places. The connection to Saint Nicholas. Though terrifying, the shadows were not independent. They were extensions of Nicholas himself, remnants of his duality. The bright Nicholas rewarded obedience. The shadows punished failure. In this way, even the simplest Yuletide night was part of a much larger system of morality enforced by fear, darkness, and unseen power. Some manuscripts suggest the shadows were a warning system, a method for Nicholas to track the naughty and the righteous. The well-behaved were left in safety. The misbehaved were sometimes lured into snow-filled forests, tested for courage, or marked for later punishment. Even centuries later, these shadows were believed to return to protect and punish, invisible but ever present during winter nights. The Winter Night Test. One surviving record tells of a small village in Germany
where a boy named Jakob ignored his mother's warnings to stay indoors. That night, snow fell so thick that the boy could barely see his feet. A faint red glow appeared in the distance, accompanied by soft bells and whispers. Jakob followed the lights, thinking them friendly. The villagers found him at dawn, sitting beneath a tree in the forest, unharmed but forever changed. His hair had turned almost white. His eyes had grown distant, as if seeing things that were not there. And he refused to speak of the night, only whispering, "The shadows, they judge." This incident became one of many documented across centuries, proof that the Yuletide shadows were more than superstition. The legacy of the shadows. Even as Christmas tradition softened over time, the shadows never truly disappeared. They remain in folk tales, in cautionary stories, and in the fear of misbehaving children. The modern cheerful Santa Claus is a veneer over centuries of dark rituals, punishments, and moral tests. The Yuletide shadows serve as a reminder. Beneath the gifts, laughter, and songs lies a history of fear. A winter where St. Nicholas walked hand in hand with darkness, his shadows ensuring that obedience, morality, and survival were inseparable. And every long, silent night, if one listens carefully, the faint whisper of chains, bells, and footsteps can still be heard, echoes of the shadows of centuries past. Even after centuries, the darkness of winter lingered. Long before cheerful Christmas trees and twinkling lights, the Yuletide season was a time of shadows, fear, and unspoken rituals. Villagers would gather in their homes as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, only to feel the chill of unseen eyes watching from the forests, hills, and rooftops. They called them the Yuletide shadows, figures born of the same dark legacy that had once accompanied St. Nicholas. The origin of the shadows. Legends claim that every time Nicholas or his darker counterpart walked the earth, he left traces of his power behind. These traces became spirits, neither fully benevolent nor malevolent. Some appeared as black, wispy figures, stretching across the walls of homes. Others mimicked children's laughter, luring the curious into the snow. And a few bore glowing red eyes, watching silently, ready to punish disobedience. These shadows were particularly active during long, cold winter nights, when humans were weakest and fear ran strongest. The warnings of the elders. Elders taught their children, "When the wind whispers through the chimney, do not leave your bed. When the bells sound uneven, do not answer. When a red figure passes by, remember, not all gifts are kind." Stories describe houses where furniture shifted overnight, candles extinguished by invisible hands, and faint footsteps pacing along hallways. Those who ignored the warnings sometimes vanished, their parents finding only tiny, perfectly arranged shoes by the hearth the next morning. Some children returned months later, changed. Their eyes were darkened, voices hollow, and they spoke of whispers in the snow, calling them to unknown places. The connection to St. Nicholas. Though terrifying, the shadows were not independent. They were extensions of Nicholas himself, remnants of his duality. The bright Nicholas rewarded obedience. The shadows punished failure. In this way, Even the simplest Yuletide night was part of a much larger system of morality enforced by fear, darkness, and unseen power. Some manuscripts suggest the shadows were a warning system, a method for Nicholas to track the naughty and the righteous. The well-behaved were left in safety. The misbehaved were sometimes lured into snow-filled forests, tested for courage, or marked for later punishment. Even centuries later, these shadows were believed to return to protect and punish, invisible but ever present during winter nights. The Winter Night Test. One surviving record tells of a small village in Germany where a boy named Jakob ignored his mother's warnings to stay indoors. That night, snow fell so thick that the boy could barely see his feet. A faint red glow appeared in the distance, accompanied by soft bells and whispers. Jakob followed the lights, thinking them friendly. The villagers found him at dawn, sitting beneath a tree in the forest, unharmed but forever changed. His hair had turned almost white. His eyes had grown distant, as if seeing things that were not there, and he refused to speak of the night, only whispering, "The shadows, they judge." This incident became one of many documented across centuries, proof that the Yuletide shadows were more than superstition. The legacy of the shadows. Even as Christmas traditions softened over time, the shadows never truly disappeared. They remain in folk tales, in cautionary stories, and in the fear of misbehaving children. The modern cheerful Santa Claus is a veneer over centuries of dark rituals, punishments, and moral tests. The Yuletide shadows serve as a reminder. Beneath the gifts, laughter, and songs lies a history of fear. A winter where St. Nicholas walked hand in hand with darkness, his shadows ensuring that obedience, morality, and survival were inseparable. And every long, silent night, if one listens carefully, the faint whisper of chains, bells, and footsteps can still be heard, echoes of the shadows of centuries past. Far to the north, beyond the forests and mountains, the land was harsher, colder, and darker than anywhere else in Europe. Snowstorms could last weeks, and the nights stretched endlessly. It was here, in the frozen villages of Scandinavia, that the darker legacy of St. Nicholas took its most terrifying form, a reckoning of morality, fear, and survival. The legend of the Northern Saint. In these lands, Nicholas was known not merely as a saint, but as a judge of souls. He would appear suddenly, often on the roofs of houses, sometimes shrouded in snow and mist. His presence was heralded by the faint jingling of ancient bells, uneven and discordant, warning the townspeople that he was near. The Northern Saint was not merciful by default. Every year he evaluated the behavior of children, adults, and even entire villages. Those who failed his judgment faced punishment beyond imagination. The test of the innocent. According to surviving manuscripts from the 15th century, innocent children would receive small gifts, tokens of protection and blessings for the coming year. Mischievous or dishonest children would disappear into the forest at night, led by a glowing figure in red, their footsteps silent in the snow. Some were returned by morning, changed, eyes that seemed older than their age, whispers of things only the dark could reveal, a lingering fear of snow, bells, and the night itself. Others never returned. Families would find only tiny shoes lined neatly outside their homes, a haunting signature of the northern saint's judgment. The forest of the lost. Central to the northern reckoning was a vast frozen forest, untouched by humans. Villagers swore it was alive, responding to sound and movement. Every footprint left in its snow would vanish as if swallowed by the land itself. The forest was where the Punisher Saint and his shadows tested the lost. One tale tells of a boy named Eric who wandered into the forest after trying to steal a loaf of bread. He saw the red figure standing silently beneath a twisted pine. Its robe was soaked, its edges flickering like flames in the snow. Chains rattled, and yet the sound seemed distant, as though echoing from another world. Eric froze. The figure raised its hand, and the boy felt a pulse of cold through his chest, as if the very air had turned to ice. When he awoke, he was back at home, but he had changed. He spoke no more of his experience, and his laughter never returned. The villagers whispered, "He has judged him. The forest keeps its own." The northern rites. It is said that the northern saint required rituals to keep the shadows bound. Candles were placed in windows to guide the lost. Shoes and gifts were left outside as tokens of protection. Songs and prayers were sung to appease the unseen forces. Those who ignored the rituals risked the wrath of the saint and his terrifying attendants, who carried sticks, chains, and sacks into the night. Some manuscripts suggest that the punishment was never physical death, but a stripping of innocence, leaving children and adults forever haunted by the night. The legacy of the Northern Reckoning. Even as European culture softened over the centuries, the Northern traditions persisted. In Scandinavia, stories of Santa's darker side remained, often woven into Christmas celebrations. Krampus and Knecht Ruprecht were said to follow the saint, enforcing justice while he rewarded the obedient. And the forests, silent and vast, continued to inspire fear and caution during long winter nights. The Northern Reckoning serves as a chilling reminder. Santa Claus was not always a figure of joy. He is a being of dual nature, enforcing morality with both gifts and fear, guiding the innocent while punishing the guilty. And in the frozen northern forests, under the long winter nights, some claim they can still hear the faint echo of chains and bells carried across the snow, a warning that the reckoning is never truly over.
Perhaps the most terrifying relic of the St. Nicholas legend is the sack, a simple object transformed over centuries into a tool of fear, not for gifts, not for treats, but for the collection of what the shadows demanded. The origin of the sack. The earliest records of the sack come from Germanic villages in the 15th century. Children who misbehaved were said to be carried off in a red cloth sack, their cries swallowed by the snow. The sack was said to be endless, stretching far beyond what human eyes could see. Its purpose was not death, it was a testing ground. The sack was sometimes filled with snow, thorns, or coal,
but the children inside were forced to face visions of their own misdeeds, as if the fabric itself had the power to separate truth from lies, courage from fear. The collection of innocence. Some manuscripts describe the sack as a spiritual device, capable of holding the essence of innocence, not the body. Children were placed inside temporarily, sometimes for hours, sometimes for nights. They emerged pale, shaken, often forever changed, carrying memories of shadows, glowing eyes, and whispers they could not explain. One tale tells of a boy named Wilhelm. He stole a loaf of bread and was taken in the sack. Inside, he experienced visions of his sins, replaying in the darkness. A red glow appeared, illuminating the twisted faces of his past actions. When he emerged, he was no longer the same boy. The villagers whispered that the sack did not punish, it educated through terror. The red figure and the sack. The sack was always accompanied by the tall red figure, the original Saint Nicholas, or his Punisher form. Some claimed his eyes glowed faintly like embers in the darkness. Others said he whispered to the children words of judgment and warning. And the sack itself seemed to respond, growing heavier or lighter, depending on the child's behavior. The combination of the figure and the sack created a mechanism of morality, one that was terrifyingly effective. The stories of vanished children ensured obedience and virtue were enforced not by law, but by fear. The legacy of the sack. Over the centuries, the sack became a symbol, gradually sanitized into a gift-bearing bag of candy or toys. The terrifying original purpose was erased from memory. Yet some folklore suggests that even today, in remote villages, the sack is still considered a tool of moral reckoning. Some children claim that if you misbehave, you will hear the rustle of cloth at night, even when no one is there. Shoes placed outside remain as a symbolic offering, a modern echo of the original ritual. And the stories of chains, whispers, and glowing eyes persist, hidden beneath cheerful carols and festive lights. The sack of souls reminds us that Santa Claus's history is steeped in fear as much as joy, and that the line between gift and punishment has always been thin, almost invisible, hidden in shadows and whispered warnings. While Saint Nicholas traveled from village to village, rewarding the obedient, his darker side did not act alone. The legends tell of Krampus, the horned, chained beast of alpine folklore, who walked in tandem with the Punisher Santa. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance, balancing mercy and terror, light and shadow. The Dark Companion. Krampus is no recent invention. Early manuscripts from the 12th century describe him as a creature of punishment, summoned by the saint to enforce morality. Horned, hoofed, and draped in chains, Krampus would appear where fear and misbehavior were strongest. He was not inherently evil, but a force of consequence, ensuring that no child escaped judgment. Villagers spoke of the night Krampus and Saint Nicholas first appeared together. The bells clanged, the wind howled, and the shadows of two figures stretched across the snow. One held gifts, one held chains, and the children did not know which would reach them first. The rule of fear and mercy. The alliance was strict. Nicholas rewarded obedience, guided morality, and ensured innocence. Krampus punished the wicked, dragged them into forests, and reminded the world that every action had consequence. Children who tried to deceive or escape were often taken by Krampus, only to be returned hours later, pale, trembling, and carrying the memory of chains, claws, and whispers. Some manuscripts even suggest that Krampus's chains could mark a child spiritually, leaving scars in the soul that could last a lifetime. The Night of Shadows. One legendary account comes from a village in Austria. A group of children had stolen food and lied to their parents. That night, Nicholas appeared on the rooftops with his glowing staff. At the same time, Krampus emerged from the forest, chains rattling, eyes glowing. The children heard bells, footsteps, and growls, and when they dared peek, they saw the figures moving as one, alternating between reward and punishment. One boy, Jakob, described the sight later. The red man held a light, and the horned beast held shadows. They were brothers and enemies all at once. By morning, the children had learned obedience through fear that would haunt them for decades. The Ancient Pact. Legends hint that Saint Nicholas and Krampus were once part of the same being. Nicholas represented the light, mercy, and hope of humanity. Krampus represented darkness, punishment, and the shadows of human sin. Some scholars believe that centuries ago, this being split into two to carry out both roles. Bound by ritual and morality, they cannot act independently. Nicholas cannot punish beyond mercy. Krampus cannot reward. Together, they maintain the balance, and the world trembles under their dual watch. The legacy of the alliance. Even as Christmas became commercialized and jolly, the alliance persisted, hidden in folklore. Krampus remains in alpine celebrations, often a playful mask of a punishing figure. Nicholas evolved into Santa Claus, yet shadows of his punisher form still linger in stories, fears, and traditions. This uneasy duality reminds us, every gift comes with judgment. Every joy carries a shadow. Wherever Saint Nicholas walks, Krampus follows, not as enemy, but as enforcer. And in the coldest nights of winter, some claim that bells rattle, chains scrape, and the shadow of red looms over all who dare to misbehave. As centuries passed, Saint Nicholas transformed. The Punisher, the Northern Saint, the Red Wraith, and even his alliance with Krampus gradually became myth, legend, and finally folklore. But the legacy remained, etched into the winter nights, the forests, and the fear that once guided behavior across Europe. From fear to folklore. By the 19th century, Nicholas had taken a new form. The jolly, white-bearded Santa Claus, dressed in red, with gifts and a warm smile. The terrifying punishments and blood-lit rituals faded from memory. Krampus became a carnival figure, more mischief than horror. Yet beneath the festive cheer, the truth persisted. Shoes left by the hearth, coal for the naughty, bells and whispered warnings, all are remnants of the original fear that shaped morality, the shadows that once stalked children across the snow. The Eternal Watcher. Legends insist that Saint Nicholas never fully abandons his old role. On long, silent winter nights, the wind carries faint jingles of bells that don't belong to any church. Shadows linger where there should be light. Children still sense a presence watching, judging, not to harm, but to ensure the balance of innocence and virtue. Some claim that even in modern times he chooses who to reward and who to warn, his methods subtle, almost invisible, but the system remains unchanged. The price of innocence. The darkest aspect of Nicholas's legacy is the understanding that innocence is a currency. Children's courage, honesty, and purity have always been the unseen measure of morality. Every gift, every punishment, every whispered warning is tied to this invisible ledger of morality. And if the ledger falls out of balance, the shadows return. Even now, villagers in remote parts of Europe maintain old traditions. Shoes left by the fire as offerings, candles lit to protect against winter spirits, stories told to ensure children respect the night. It is not superstition, it is memory of the fear that once kept the world in balance. The duality of Santa Claus. The modern Santa Claus is two beings in one, the joyful giver, warmth, generosity, laughter, and light, the punisher, shadows, judgment, vigilance, and subtle terror. This duality ensures that the legacy of Saint Nicholas is eternal. Even as cultures changed, the myth preserved a dark truth. There is always a cost. There is always a balance. Every gift and joy is measured against fear and consequence. And so, as snow falls on silent nights, and carols echo softly through homes, the shadows linger. A shoe by the hearth, a faint rustle outside, a chill in the air. These are not accidents. They are echoes of centuries of judgment, of chains, of Krampus, of the red wraith. The world may have forgotten the terrifying origins of Santa Claus, but those who listen carefully can still hear the faint whisper of the original Punisher. Remember, be good, or the shadows will come for you. The legacy of Saint Nicholas endures, not just in gifts, not just in laughter, but in the fear that once shaped humanity, hidden in every shadow of winter, waiting patiently for the long night to fall again. As the snow falls silently on these forgotten tales, remember that the stories of Saint Nicholas are more than myths. They are shadows of the past, a reminder of fear, morality, and the price of innocence. And while the modern world celebrates with lights and laughter, the dark legacy still whispers in the long winter nights. If you found this journey into the shadows of history chilling, disturbing, and unforgettable, there's so much more waiting for you. Subscribe to Knox Hour and join us as we explore the world's darkest secrets, terrifying legends, and hidden horrors. Stories that will keep you awake long after the video ends. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications, because the shadows are always watching, and the next story is just around the corner. Stay curious, stay cautious, and never underestimate what lurks in the dark.